All right, so we're diving deep today into some pretty fascinating stuff. You sent over these sources about the name Hazara and like its connection to the Hazara people, mainly in Hazara, central Afghanistan, but also parts of Pakistan and Iran. And what we're going to try to do is figure out like where does this name come from? When do we first see it? Like attached to this group, and even like what were they maybe called before?
Yeah, it's like a historical word puzzle.
Right.
It is. And, the goal here is to understand, like, the journey of this name, especially when you think about the history of the Hazara people. Like, understanding a name can tell you so much about identity, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so here's where it gets really fascinating. The most common theory links Hazara back to the Persian word Hazar, which means 1,000.
Okay.
And this could refer to just a large population. Or it could be a translation of the Mongolian word Mingin, which was a military unit of 1,000 soldiers during Genghis Khan's time.
Okay.
So that would link the name to a very specific historical period and even like a possible Mongol military origin.
Oh, wow. But like the connection to Genghis Khan's army is not completely solid, is it?
Right.
Like your sources even point out that there's no direct historical evidence that Genghis Khan, specifically said, hey, go settle in Hazarajat or anything like that. So it makes you wonder, right, if the Hazar connection might have come about in some other, more roundabout way.
Absolutely. I mean, it's definitely a possibility. And what's also really intriguing is this alternative idea proposed by the historian Abdul Hai Habibi, who suggests that Hazara actually might have evolved from Hazala. It's an older word meaning kind-hearted.
Oh, wow.
So this kind of like flips the script on the name's meaning,
Yeah.
right? It suggests a more inherent or like descriptive origin based on maybe a perceived characteristic of the people themselves.
Interesting. So we have this potential link with Hazar, meaning 1,000, potentially Hazala as well.
Right.
Now, the word Hazara actually shows up even earlier than all this. We see it with this 11th century Persian poet Nasir Khusraw Balkhi. And it seems like he might have been using it to refer to a musical instrument. So the word definitely existed even before the Mongol period.
Yeah.
But directly connecting it to, the ethnic group at that point in time is kind of difficult.
Yeah.
It might have just been a word with like a bunch of different meanings back then.
Exactly. And to add another layer to this whole thing, think about this.
Yeah.
The Hazara people themselves, in their own Hazaragi dialect, often refer to themselves as Azra or Azara. So this internal name, right, it might give us some clues about how the group sees itself. And it could even have a totally separate origin from this external name, Hazara.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So when do we actually first see the word Hazara used to clearly refer to this specific group?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? Yeah. So the sources you sent really highlight the early 16th century, and specifically the writings of Babur, the founder of the Mughal Empire.
Okay.
In his book, the Baburnama, he mentions some really specific Hazara tribes, like the Sultan Masudi Hazara, the Turkmen Hazara, even the Kedi Hazara. And this really indicates that by the 1500s, Hazara wasn't just referring to a place. It had become this identifier for like distinct groups of people.
Okay, so that's a big shift.
Yeah, for sure.
Because we have Nasir Khusraw mentioning it earlier, but, maybe not in the same way.
Right, exactly. While that earlier mention is definitely noteworthy, Babur using it to name specific tribes in his book makes it much clearer that, Hazara was really an ethnic or tribal marker by the beginning of the 16th century.
So Hazara comes into clearer focus in the 16th century. But before that, what were they called?
Yeah, good question. So one theory is that they might have already been called Hazara even in ancient times, simply because of their large population.
Oh,
Linking back to that Persian Hazar, just a way to say, hey, there are a lot of these people.
right.
Like more than 1,000, kind of a loose description.
So we got a lot of potential names floating around.
We do.
We also have this link being made to ancient geographical names, like Husala, mentioned by a 7th century Chinese traveler, Shenzong. And then there's Ozala, mentioned by Ptolemy, a 2nd century Greek geographer.
Right.
But it's important to remember that just because the names sound kind of similar,
Yeah,
it doesn't automatically mean they're talking about the same group of people.
absolutely. I mean, it's definitely something to consider, but you can't jump to conclusions based on that alone. And then you have all these regional differences in how they were referred to. Like in the Ghilzai region, Hazaras were sometimes called Mughal, which kind of feeds into that whole Mongol descent theory that's still debated. But they were also called things like Korluk, Kalaj, Turkmen, maybe suggesting some past alliances or tribal affiliations.
Wow.
It's pretty complex, and even the historical region of Hazarajat, that area itself, was also known as Barbaristan and later as Gargistan.
It's a lot to untangle. So going back to the sources, it seems like the Baburnama from the 16th century is really a key piece of evidence when it comes to understanding, how the name Hazara was being used early on.
It really is.
Of course, later histories and, geographical texts can also add to the picture. And something really important to keep in mind is that all historical sources, they can have their own biases,
For sure.
especially, like you were saying, sources written by groups that were maybe in conflict with the Hazara.
Absolutely. I mean, perspective plays a huge role in how history is recorded. And it's crucial to consider those perspectives when you're trying to piece together the truth. And the Baburnama, it's not just about the name. When Babur describes these different Hazara tribes, like where they were located, how they interacted with other groups, their military strength, it gives us this really valuable glimpse into how they were perceived in the early 1500s.
Yeah, and that can really add some color to like the bigger historical picture.
Exactly.
So after this deep dive, going through all this information, what are we left with? I mean, we see that the name Hazara probably comes from the Persian word for thousand.
Mm-hmm.
It could be connected to Mongol military terms, or maybe it's just describing a large population. And that first clear use of it to refer to this specific ethnic group,
Right.
we find it in those early 16th century writings by Biber.
Exactly. I mean, that's when it really starts to solidify as an ethnic identifier.
All right, let's dive into this. You sent over some really interesting sources about the Hazara and the history of their name. And we're going to try to figure out, is it just from the Mongol Empire? Or is there like more to it? For everyone listening, we've got all the classic theories about Genghis Khan's armies and stuff, but also some pretty compelling arguments that might be older and indigenous. We're going to look at the language, any historical mentions, even like geography, see if we can put the pieces together. It's a real puzzle.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one. The popular idea is that Hazara comes from the Persian word hazar, meaning 1,000, right? Maybe connecting it to those Mongol military units. They were called a mingan, I think. So the thinking is that this word just became the name for anyone thought to be descended from those Mongol soldiers. And sometimes that's linked to like physical features too. But this whole idea has some big problems. There are other ideas out there that say it goes way further back, maybe even centuries before the Mongols even showed up.
Right. Yeah. And there's this one alternative I found really interesting. It's from this Afghan scholar, Abdul Hai Habibi. He says Hazara comes from Hazala, which means kind-hearted or happy, and that this was around way before the Mongols. He thinks the whole 1,000 thing was added later, like an interpretation that stuck to the name. What's wild is that the Hazara themselves often use Azra or Azara. Could that be like another clue, maybe even closer to this Hazala idea?
Oh, that's a great point. If we look at the language itself, Hazaragi does have some Mongol and Turkic words sprinkled in, but the foundation is Persian, like Dari. And that tells us they've had a long connection to Iranian culture and language, which could go back to before the Mongols had much influence on their name at all.
For sure. And Habibi also points out that Hazara, or names similar to it, show up in other places, not just central Afghanistan, like Kashmir and by the Indus River.
Yeah.
Those weren't really hit that hard by the Mongol Empire. And there's the Hazara region in Pakistan, too, which might be linked to older names like Abhisara or Orasa. It really suggests that it was more widespread before the Mongols. Like, it makes you wonder how far back and how far out this name or its root really goes.
Yeah. And what's really striking are the times it's mentioned in history before the Mongols even came around. In the 7th century, you have this Chinese traveler, Xuanzang. He mentioned a place called Hosala, like a secondary capital in the Arakosia region. And a scholar named Saint Martin thought this could be related to Hazara. Then there's the Greek geographer Ptolemy. He mentioned a place called Ozala in the same area, like way back in ancient times. What do you make of those early mentions? Like, how do they fit with the Mongol theory?
Well, it's pretty significant, right? To have these names popping up centuries before the Mongols got there, it means the name or something super close to it was already being used in that area, which definitely challenges the idea that it just came from the Mongols in the 13th century, you know? And it's really important to remember that there's no direct historical or archaeological evidence to definitively say that Hazara only comes from those Mongol military groups. Some old texts mention Mongol-speaking groups, but no modern researchers have actually found any Hazara who speak Mongol.
Yeah, exactly. And then you've got these other ideas that connect Hazara origins to different indigenous groups who were living in those central highlands before the Mongols even existed. There's the possibility that Hazara was just a regional term, maybe for an area with tons of like rivers or valleys or mountains. Someone even thought it could be connected to that old Khazar kingdom near the Caspian Sea. And there's even this old record of the Hazara region giving 1,000 horsemen as tribute to these ancient kings. When we consider all these different possibilities, what do you think it tells us?
Well, it sounds like it's a lot more complicated than just a conquering army leaving behind descendants, right? The name could have evolved over time, maybe merging with existing words, or it could have originally meant something totally different before it became the name for a specific group.
Right. We even see that complexity later on in history in the Baburnama, which was written by Babur in the early 16th century. He uses Hazara to talk about specific tribes, like the Sultan Masudi and the Turkmen Hazara. But here's the interesting thing. He uses Nikdara, or Nikudara, for people he identifies as having Mongol origins. Like, he makes a distinction between them.
Wow. And going even further back, there's this 11th century Persian poet, Nasir Khusraw-Balkhi. He used the word Hazara in his poetry, which means the term was around way before the 16th century. It really makes you think about how the meaning and the use of the name could have shifted and changed over such a long time.
Definitely. And most academics nowadays would agree. It's not a simple answer. There's a lot of support now for these alternative ideas, saying it's more indigenous, and pre-Mongol scholars like Habibi are bringing a lot of linguistic and historical evidence to the table. And while genetic studies do show a mix of East and West Eurasian lineages, a direct link to a specific Mongol garrison is still up for debate. Some researchers even suggest that the Hazara identity itself developed over centuries through shared experiences of being marginalized and resistance, not just because of a single Mongol origin point. It's super interesting when you think about it from all those angles.
So for everyone listening, what does this all mean for you? It seems like the story of the name Hazara is much richer and more complicated than just being connected to the Mongol Empire. While that theory has some merit, the evidence is pointing towards deeper, maybe indigenous roots, and different meanings that stretch back centuries before Genghis Khan.
Right, all the linguistic clues. The fact that similar names are scattered geographically. And those mentions from before the Mongols arrived. It all creates this picture of a name with a much longer and more nuanced history. And the fact that we don't have any solid proof tying it solely to Mongol settlements really makes the case for checking out those other possibilities.
And this brings up a really important question for everyone to think about. If the name Hazara really does have these pre-Mongol origins, and if there are all these different ways to interpret it, how might that change how we understand the Hazara community's history and their identity today? It's definitely something to consider.
It really is.
Thanks for joining me today for this deep dive into the Hazara.
You're very welcome. It was a pleasure.
And to all our listeners, thanks for tuning in.
Until next time.
Bye.